This is Dominissimo Voxlore, transmitting from the abyss where light dares not reach. In this broadcast we descend into the legacy of the Night Lords, the sons of Nostramo, the Legion of Terror, the predators shaped by the vision and madness of their father, Konrad Curze. This is not a tale of glory, nor of conquest. It is the chronicle of executioners who turned on their own kin, of worlds broken by fear before the first drop pod ever struck, of a Primarch who foresaw his own death and embraced it. Strike the seal of subscription, or be left in the dark with the rest of the prey. Still your breath, steel your heart. This is Dominissimo Voxlore, and this is the creed of the Night Lords. Nostramo did not know sunrise. Its dying star cast only a jaundiced twilight that never reached the choking streets of Nostramo Quintus, where neon guttered, rain hissed on cracked ferrocrete, and the air tasted of iron and ash. Beneath the hive's corroded spires, the city's heartbeat was the click of rivet guns, the thud of body chutes, and the soft, routine snap of knives in alleys too narrow for law to enter. Industry fed the world, despair fed everything else. When governors spoke of order, they meant of momentary stalemate between gangs and corrupt enforcers. When priests whispered of hope, they did it behind blast doors. Into that endless night fell a star. The impact shattered an underhive plaza and fused the slag rubble into a glass-black bowl. Workers and gangers crept to the lip and saw, amid the steaming metal, the shape of a child dragging itself upright, skin pallid, eyes like chips of obsidian. The first witnesses fled, swearing they had seen a demon. The underhive learned a different truth before the week was out. Whatever had fallen into Nostramo did not fear the dark. It hunted in it. He grew without parents, tutors, or kindness, learning the city's lessons the way Nostramo taught everything, through pain. He learned to stalk by tracing the footfalls that faltered, to eat by taking what would not be missed, to sleep with his back to the unyielding walls and a knife beneath his tongue. Bodies began turning up in sluices, men whose name was spoken with fear in gambling dens and backroom markets, enforcers whose bribes had paid for a dozen murders, a magistrate who had sold an entire hab block to a black lung mine and called it debt relief. Their corpses were not merely killed, they were exhibited, they were warnings. The city named the new fear the Night Haunter long before anyone saw him. Mothers hissed the syllables to silence screaming children. Gang lieutenants posted watchers with floodlamps that did not live till morning. Street markets thinned after dusk, and even the bold learned to keep their stairs lit. Yet the mines shipped on time, and the forges ran hotter. In the ledger books of Nostramo, the trend was undeniable. The night was full of terror, and terror made the city work. He chose his victims with a ruthless logic that felt like morality in a place starving for any. He bled out predators first, pimps, murderers, syndicate accountants with hands cleaner than their invoices. He carved a map of guilt onto the city's bones, scouring one district at a time until even the bravest began to police their own. Where he found a den of child butchers, he turned their hooks into collars and left them strung from a transit gantry, facing the first pale hour before shift change. Where he uncovered a bribery ring in the enforcers' ranks, he left numbers burned into each corpse's forehead, the amounts they had taken. He did not simply kill, he judged. Dreams came early and never stopped. Sometimes they were Nostramo, drowned in siren blue light and sundered by a spear of radiance. Sometimes they were men like him, giants, but different, arrayed in thunderous armour and speaking voices that shook the halls. Sometimes they were a figure of gold whose shadow was as terrible as his light. He woke with new scars most mornings and older certainties every night. There would be a reckoning, it would carry his name, and all the means of justice that men claimed to own would fail long before his own. When at last he walked into the light, it was under the chandeliers of the high spire. He came to the nobles' conclaves in silence, barefoot, sopping rain into polished marble. The lords had posted 8 gun thrones and a dozen private guards. They fired first. He crossed the floor between beats of their thunder and pulled a baron from his grav chair by the jaw. The rest lowered their weapons. They were not brave, they recognised a new price of doing business. He spoke little. He showed ledgers. He listed names. He described the weight and shape of each noble's crimes exactly, and with a predator's patience, left the next words for them to fill. Restitution, resignation, or exemplary punishment. Some paid and left the planet. Some paid and stayed. Some chose poorly, and he decorated the promenade with reminders. He did not take a throne. He took a schedule, a quota, a set of keys to the city's arsenal. The enforcers who could not be bought he promoted. The rest he sent home in crates. Production rose. Murders fell. Suicide harvesters, the grim maintenance crews who cleared those who had opted out, came back with empty carts. Nostramo's laughable courts began to matter because fear made attendance compulsory. The city did not love its saviour, the city did not love anything, but industry sang, and for Nostramo, that was the closest thing to grace. He allowed himself to be seen just often enough to make myth keep pace with fact. On a catwalk above the blast furnaces, a midnight figure with eyes reflecting fire. In an underhive chapel, standing beside a mother who dared to bury her son with their name. On the balcony of a shuttered pleasure hall, handing a ledger to the only auditor who had refused a bribe. The city learned a new proverb: work hard, speak low, do not look up. The dreams worsened. He saw a sky torn open from pole to pole. He watched cities burn beneath banners he could almost remember, and faces that made his jaw ache with recognition. He bled from his palms while he slept, and woke with the taste of ozone behind his teeth. He carved his certainty into the steel lintel above the spire's great door, a phrase hammered in letters long as a man's arm. Order is the opposite of comfort. When the ships came, they lit Nostramo like dawn. Even from the high spire, the first sight of them was painful. Spears of argent and gold parting the night, their engines painting the clouds in sunlight colours no Nostramo had words for. The city fell silent. Even the forges dimmed as if they had forgotten how to burn in the presence of that light. He walked alone to the blast field where he had once fallen, and waited. They came in a wedge of impossible warriors, their armour bright as a cathedral, and at their point a figure no myth could contain. The city did not kneel, it collapsed. Men and women reached for their faces to shield their eyes and realised, for the first time, that tears could come from brightness as well as grief. The golden figure stopped a sword lengths away. There was warmth in his voice that Nostramo had never taught. Be at peace, Konrad Curze. I have arrived, and I intend to take you home. The name hit him like a memory returned to its rightful owner. Konrad Curze. It fit his bones. It made sense of his dreams. It told him why his hands had always known the weight of judgment. He lowered his head. The rain hissed on Oromite and Ferrocrete alike. Home. What a word to speak on Nostramo. In the days that followed, the light walked the spire. Auditors from the heaven poured over ledgers with the same clinical hunger he had shown. Warriors in colbert and gold examined enforcer barracks and mine quotas. Surgeons with steady hands put a stop to the practice of cutting out weak lungs and selling them to creditors. He shadowed the golden figure, listening to sentences rendered in a different scale than his own. Sentences that did not end in blood but in edicts and plans and something more dangerous than either: hope. He had ruled with fear because fear worked. It was the one currency Nostramo would not counterfeit. Yet the presence of the golden figure made him admit a second truth. Fear could hold a city, but it could not lift one. Fear could silence screams, it could not teach people to sing. He walked the underhive one last time before he left. He traced his old circuit, a stairwell where he had learned to descend without sound, an alley where he had killed a magistrate who called his theft policy, a gantry where rain had washed away the blood of men who thought buying children was right. He stood on the promenade and watched workers file into the dawn coloured by engines he could not see, and felt a new kind of ache. Loss, not of prey or purpose, but of the simplicity of a world where every problem could be solved by making someone afraid. When the time came, he climbed the boarding ramp without ceremony. Nostramo did not wave, Nostramo did not cheer. It simply kept working, because that was what Nostramo knew how to do. The golden figure waited at the threshold, light pooling around him like a promise. Konrad Curze paused and looked back. The spires were needles against a sky that never learned to glow. He tasted metal, rain, and the faintest trace of something the underhive had never had a word for. He turned and stepped into the light. When the Emperor revealed Konrad Curze to the Imperium, he also revealed to the Primarch the sons who had already bore his blood. The VIII Legion had existed long before its gene sire was found. In those early days it was composed largely of Terran stock, forged in the gene labs of the Emperor, and it had fought dutifully across the stars during the opening years of the Great Crusade. But the moment Curze set eyes upon them, the relationship between Master and Legion shifted forever. He saw not simply warriors, he saw the perfect vessels for his philosophy. The Terran veterans had carried themselves with a hard, pragmatic discipline. They had been raised in the Emperor's armies, taught to conquer, to police, and to bring order through the might of their gene-enhanced bodies. Yet as Curze examined them, he judged them wanting. To him, they fought wars as soldiers, not as executioners. He would remake them in his own reflection, as predators who understood that fear was sharper than any blade. The process began the moment he took command. Curze gave his legion new colours, midnight blue as the void, trimmed in black that seemed to swallow the eye. Onto this blank canvas his sons painted the sigil of death: skulls, flayed wings, jagged lightning bolts, every mark designed to gnaw at the mind before the bolter was ever raised. They became not an army of compliance but an army of warning. The VIII Legion was renamed the Night Lords, and from the first campaign they fought beneath Curze's gaze, the galaxy learned that their battles were not merely about victory. They were about messages carved into the soul of mankind. Their first tests came swiftly. a cluster of mining worlds in the Caroni Reach declared independence from the Imperium, emboldened by distance from Terra's rule. Other legions might have come with speeches and measured fire. The Night Lords descended in silence, drop pods striking like meteors across the chief settlement. When the dust cleared, every administrator of the rebellion was nailed to the spire of the governor's palace, their innards spilling onto the crowd below. Curze made sure the display was broadcast on every public screen across the system. Resistance collapsed within hours. An Imperial remembrancer later recorded in hushed tones, "They did not conquer, they demonstrated. We obeyed not because they asked, but because the alternative was a vision we could not endure." This became their method again and again. On Caru, they dragged criminals and rebels through the streets by chains hooked through their eyes. On Thalano Secundus, they turned entire manufactorums into carnal houses, each worker's death left as a tableau for the survivors to stumble across. They did not simply kill, they staged death as theatre, each atrocity designed to multiply its own retelling. At first, the Imperium lauded the results. Administratum ties flowed without delay. Sectors long known for their stubbornness suddenly prospered. Commanders for other legions, those who struggled through endless sieges, watched Curze's victories with a mix of envy and unease. To the Emperor himself, the results were efficient. When governors questioned the imperial decree, the answer became a phrase muttered across the halls of terror: "Send the Eighth." The arrival of the Night Lords was a punishment no world wished to call. Yet within the Legion itself, tension simmered. The Terran core of the Eighth had expected to fight as exemplars of the Emperor's will. Instead, they found themselves compelled into roles as torturers and stage managers of mass killings. Some resisted quietly, others grew to relish it. But as time wore on, Curze began demanding reinforcements from his homeworld, Nostramo. From its endless hive cities came a flood of recruits, men who had only known crime, fear and cruelty since birth. They passed the brutal initiation trials of the Legion with ease, for violence was their native tongue. These Nostramo Astartes eclipsed the old Terrans, bringing with them a feral delight in the horrors their Primarch commanded. The influx warped the Legion. Terran officers who questioned the methods found themselves marginalised or quietly removed. The Nostramans rose quickly, their cruelty praised as zeal. Under their influence, atrocities multiplied, not only as calculated terror, but as indulgence. Flensing, mutilation, ritualised displays of corpses all became common as the sound of chainswords. The Night Lords became not merely a weapon of fear, but a legion devouring itself with the same corruption that had consumed Nostramo. Outside their ranks, their reputation spread faster than any warp signal. Refugees whispered of them as shadows with burning eyes. Enemies reported whole garrisons surrendering at the rumour of their arrival. Even allies began to shudder when their warships translated into orbit. The word-bearers, themselves no strangers to spectacle, remarked that the Night Lords seemed less a legion than a curse. Among the Primarchs, the disquiet turned to hostility. Rogel Dawn, exemplar of discipline, despised Curze's methods, seeing them as dishonour writ large. Ferrus Manus decried their wastefulness. Even Fulgrim, who had once mentored Curze in the ways of Imperial command, found himself appalled by his brother's dissent. Yet the Emperor tolerated it, perhaps believing Curze's savagery was a necessary shadow to balance his brighter suns. For a time, terror was an expedient tool, and expedience outweighed morality. But Curze's vision did not abate. He foresaw betrayal, civil war, the fall of brothers into fratricide. These revelations weighed upon him, and he confided them to Fulgrim. The Phoenician, horrified, carried word to Dawn. Confrontation followed. On the battlements of a conquered world, Dawn accused Curze of dishonouring their father's name. The Night Haunter did not argue. He struck. The two demigods clashed in a storm of blows that shook towers, until Dawn lay battered, his armour cracked, blood pouring from his mouth. Only the intervention of guards prevented Curze from killing him outright. The incident could not be hidden. A Primarch had assaulted another, nearly to the death. Curze was seized under Imperial sanction, bound in chains thicker than a man's body, and placed in confinement to await judgment. His legion, scattered across garrisons and compliance zones, waited uneasily for word of their master's fate. In his cell, Curze laughed. He had foreseen this. He had foreseen everything. The distrust of his brothers, the condemnation of the Emperor, the doom of the Imperium itself. For the Night Haunter, captivity was not a punishment but confirmation. He had always believed he was born to be an executioner, hated and feared even by those who used him. Now, as he sat in chains, he felt that belief vindicated. The Night Lords carried on their campaigns without him, but already a darkness greater than any world's midnight was gathering. The corruption of Nostramo deepened, seeding the Legion with ever more sadistic killers. The Emperor's censure loomed, and in the warp, another Primarch prepared a rebellion that would shatter the galaxy. The Eighth Legion had become what Curze had always intended, a blade honed not for glory but for dread. And blades, once bloodied, do not return to their sheath. The stage was set for the Night Lords to cross the line from enforcers of fear to outright monsters of heresy. Their transformation into a legion of terror was complete, and the Imperium itself had taught them how to wield it. The chains that bound Konrad Curze after his assault on Rogal Dorn were not forged in iron alone. They were woven from mistrust, disgust, and a gnawing recognition among the other Primarchs that their brother had gone too far. But while Curze sat confined, the greater weight pressing upon him was not judgment, it was prophecy. He had seen Nostramo's fate 100 times in fevered visions, the planet shattering beneath a lance of light. Now, cut off from his sons, he brooded on whether that destiny was his to avert or his to fulfill. Nostramo itself had never known true reform. When Curze left to join the Great Crusade, he believed his reign of terror had stamped order into the planet's bones. But Nostramo's heart was rotten, and once its avenging angel departed, the old cancer spread again. The syndicates crept back into power, the nobles bought and sold justice as before, and the mines echoed not only with the clang of picks but with the cries of slaves crushed under debt. In Curze's absence, the world reverted to what it had always been, a pit where despair bred crime and crime bred despair. Recruits sent from Nostramo to the Legion carried this corruption in their marrow. They were not penitents eager to atone in the Emperor's name, they were predators in new skin, murderers and sadists uplifted to power armour and chain blades. Veterans of terror muttered in silence as their ranks filled with these feral brothers. What had been a legion of executioners in the Emperor's service now teetered toward becoming a legion of killers who recognised no cause but cruelty. The Emperor, busy with the galaxy-spanning crusade, saw results rather than methods. So long as worlds bent the knee after the Night Lords descended, he did not call Curze to account. Yet the other Primarchs pressed the matter, arguing that the VIII Legion was more butcher than liberator. The trial was convened, and it was during that uncertain wait for judgment that word reached Curze of Nostramo's complete collapse into depravity. The message ignited a fury that scorched away any lingering restraint. To Curze, Nostramo's relapse was vindication. He had ruled through fear because fear was the only leash that worked. Remove him, and the world had plunged back into the abyss. For him, this was proof that the Emperor's dream was a lie. Humanity could not be uplifted by reason or enlightenment, it could only be shackled in terror. He tore free of his bonds with the fury of a cornered predator. Guards died in screaming handfuls, their armour rent like paper beneath his talons. In a storm of blood, the Night Haunter reclaimed his freedom. By the time the alarm ceased ringing, he had already rejoined elements of his legion. His course was set. If Nostramo could not live under his shadow, it would not live at all. The fleet translated into Nostramo's system in silence. No proclamations, no demands. The Night Lords deployed in perfect formation above their homeworld, their ships blotting out what little light the dying sun provided. The order was simple, clinical, final. Fire. Orbital lances stabbed downward, converging on a geological fault line Curze had memorised since his childhood visions. The beams drilled into the planet's crust, burning deeper with every passing second. Seismic quakes rolled across Nostramo's surface, splitting highways, toppling spires, hurling whole hab blocks into fiery chasms. Panic swept through the cities, yet there was no reprieve, no negotiation, no salvation. With a shuddering groan that echoed even through the void, Nostramo's unstable core gave way. The planet cracked, continents tearing apart as molten fire devoured them. In a single day, the Midnight World was undone, its fragments cast into the dark like cinders from a funeral pyre. Billions died, their cries lost in the vacuum before they reached the fleet above. The Night Lords watched in silence, their Primarch seated at the heart of the flagship, eyes closed. For Curze, this was not merely vengeance, it was destiny fulfilled. He had foreseen the Lance of Light, the world split into dust. Now he was both seer and executioner. In his mind, the destruction was not murder, it was judgment, and judgment had been his role since the day he crawled from the crater. When the smoke cleared, Nostramo was no more. What had been their cradle, their source of recruits, and their poisoned heart was gone. In destroying it, Curze severed the last tether between his legion and any notion of redemption. They were orphans now, a people without a world, defined only by the creed of fear their Primarch had carved into them. Word of Nostramo's annihilation reached terror like a thunderclap. The Council of Terror reeled. To exterminate an entire world, one's own world, was a crime without precedent. Edicts were drafted to brand the VIII Legion renegades, but history outran legality. For even as Curze delivered the death blow to Nostramo, Horus Lupercal prepared to deliver his own betrayal. The heresy broke open, and the galaxy drowned in a civil war. In that chaos, the crimes of the Night Lords became another strand in a wider tapestry of treachery. Curze, for his part, did not hesitate. He had never felt kinship with his brothers, save perhaps for a wary respect for Fulgrim and a venomous loathing for Dawn. When Horus called, Promising a galaxy remade without the Emperor's hypocrisy, Curze heard only confirmation of what he'd always believed. The future he had seen was unfolding. Brother would slay brother, the Imperium would burn, and he would stand vindicated in the ruins. The Night Lords answered Horus's summons with relish. They painted new horrors across the stars in his name, no longer pretending to serve the Emperor's dream. They raided colonies not to subjugate but to annihilate them, leaving flayed governors strung from vox towers as warnings. They slaughtered civilians in their millions, using terror not as a tool of policy but as indulgence. Their cry became infamous across the void: Ave Dominus Nox, hail the Night Lord. For the Imperium, Nostramo's fall was tragedy, a symbol of how far one of the Emperor's sons could fall into damnation. For Curze, it was liberation. He had cut away the last chain of obligation, no longer bound to a people, no longer tethered to a father's impossible ideals. He could embrace his nature fully. He was the Night Haunter, and his sons were creatures of fear. From that moment on, the Night Lords ceased to be a legion of enforcement. They became a legion of retribution, prowling the galaxy not as conquerors but as predators. Where they passed, light faltered, and silence followed. The destruction of Nostramo was not only the death of a world, it was the birth of a nightmare that would stalk the Imperium for 10,000 years. With Nostramo reduced to cinders, the Night Lords entered the heresy unshackled. They had no home to defend, no people to answer to, and no illusions about the righteousness of their cause. They were not conquerors marching for a vision of empire, they were predators loosed across the stars. Under Curze's guidance, the VIII Legion abandoned all pretense of justice and embraced atrocity as both method and creed. Their role in the wider war was not to hold lines or win pitched battles. Horus had legions for that. The Night Lords were unleashed as an instrument of despair. Where loyalist garrisons held out, they descended. Where imperial supply lines stretched thin, they cut them. Where civilian populations rallied in defiance, they crushed them in ways designed to break not just bodies but wills. One of their first campaigns after pledging to Horus was the savage descent on the Eastern Fringe. The region was rich with lightly defended colonies, many of them newly compliant and still unsure of imperial authority. The Night Lords struck like carrion birds, burning through whole subsectors in a matter of months. Entire star systems went silent. Ships carrying refugees emerged from the warp with crews raving of giants in midnight armour, their decks carpeted with the skin of those who resisted. In one chilling case, a whole population was herded into orbital docks and vented into space, left to drift as a constellation of frozen corpses. The genius of the Night Lords was never measured in territory gained. Their victories were written in hysteria. Governors who had never seen a Night Lord began ordering their own subjects executed on suspicion of treachery, terrified of attracting Curze's attention. Worlds surrendered to Horus's lieutenants before a single trader ship arrived, cowed by rumours of what the VIII Legion had done to their neighbours. Terror radiated outward faster than any fleet could travel, and Curze delighted in that contagion. It was in the maelstrom that Curze captured one of his most infamous prizes, Vulcan, Primarch of the Salamanders. Taken alive after the drop site massacre on Esteban V, Vulcan was shackled in the bowels of the Night Lord's flagship, Nightfall. Here, Curze indulged in a cruelty that became legend even among the atrocities of the heresy. Vulcan was unique among the Emperor's sons. Immortal, a perpetual, fated to regenerate from any wound. For Curze, this was both a torment and a challenge. He killed Vulcan 1,000 ways, burned him, drowned him, dismembered him, cast him into the void. Each time, the salamander rose again, and each time, Curze renewed the torment. But killing was not the Night Haunter's true aim. He wanted to break Vulcan's spirit, to force him to confess that mercy and nobility were lies, that all men were beasts beneath their armour. For months the ship's decks echoed with the cycle of death and resurrection. Crew whispered that their Primarch grew thinner, gaunter, as though each failed attempt to shatter Vulcan carved a new wound into his own soul. And still Vulcan defied him. When Curze orchestrated elaborate illusions, civilians burning, brothers dying, Vulcan endured. He refused to yield to despair. In the end, Vulcan escaped through sheer will and opportunity, vanishing into the void and denying Curze the satisfaction he craved. For the Night Haunter, this was not just failure, it was humiliation. The one brother he most longed to corrupt had slipped from his grasp, and the wound festered like a rot in his mind. Meanwhile, the Legion continued its bloody harvest. On Sotha, they stormed the Pharos beacon, slaying thousands of Ultramarines and refugees before they finally were driven back. On Togolsa, they massacred entire cities, leaving their flayed governors dangling from power pylons as warnings. These were not wars of conquest, they were acts of scorn against the very concept of civilization. Even Horus grew wary. The War Master valued Curze's terror for the destabilisation it sowed, but he could no longer rely on a legion that seemed intent on destruction for its own sake. Where the Iron Warriors besieged and the Sons of Horus conquered, the Night Lords left only ash and panic. They were less an army and more a spreading plague. Curze himself seemed to revel in this isolation. he began to speak less of Horus's victory and more of inevitability, the fall of the Imperium, the death of empires, and his own impending demise. He told his sons they were not chosen to rule but to punish, to be the executioners history would remember only with hatred. His visions grew darker, his laughter more hollow. Officers whispered that their father was not leading them to victory, but dragging them into an abyss. Yet the terror worked. Loyalist supply lines collapsed as worlds ceded or self-destructed rather than risk the Night Lord's wrath. Astropathic choirs sang of despair in half-dozen sectors. Some commanders begged to face the World Eaters or Emperor's children instead of the Eighth, believing madness and decadence preferable to the horrors Curze's sons inflicted. In their ranks, cruelty became a competition. Captains adorned their armour with new trophies, necklaces of teeth, cloaks of skin, helms fashioned from enemy skulls. Raptor cults, warriors who leapt screaming from the skies with jump packs and talons, spread like a contagion within the Legion. They vied with one another not for honour or strategy, but for the most terrifying spectacle of slaughter. It was during this black season that Imperial savants coined the phrase the Reign of Terror. It was not a formal campaign or a defined theatre of war, but a shadow that spread across the Imperium wherever the Night Lords prowled. To the citizenry, the phrase became prophecy. If the 8th Legion was sighted in orbit, terror would reign, and nothing would be left but silence. For Curze, this was vindication. He declared that the Imperium's reliance on his methods proved this philosophy correct. The Emperor had once used the Night Lords as the final sanction against disobedience. Now, with the galaxy burning, the entire Imperium had become a reflection of Nostramo, fearful, desperate, and clinging to order only through brutality. But the Night Haunter's vindication came with a cost. Each atrocity drove his legion further from cohesion of brotherhood and deeper into the abyss of individual sadism. They were no longer an army, but a murder of crows, each feather dripping with blood. Their terror had become too great to be controlled, even by the War Master they ostensibly served. And so the Night Lords roamed, predators without leash or purpose, spreading fear not in service of Empire rebellion, but simply because fear was all they knew. For 10,000 years to come, that legacy would echo. But in the heresy itself, it meant that whenever the Reign of Terror fell, nothing was left behind but ruins, and the certainty that the galaxy was becoming exactly what Konrad Curze has always foretold, a nightmare without end. When Horus unleashed his rebellion, each legion was cast into roles suited to their Primarch's nature. The Iron Warriors besieged, the Sons of Horus struck at the Imperium's heart, the Word-Bearers spread corruption like a liturgy. For the Night Lords, the War Master chose a different path. Konrad Curze and his sons were hurled into the eastern fringe to delay a foe as implacable as any in the Emperor's arsenal, the Dark Angels, led by the Lion himself. Thus began one of the most bitter and shadow-drenched wars of the heresy, the Thramas Crusade. Curze had no intention of meeting his brother in open battle. He knew the Dark Angels' discipline, their martial pride, their mastery of the Void. To fight them directly would invite annihilation. Instead, the Night Haunter waged a war as only he knew how, by spreading fear in the shadows, cutting supply lines, and leaving entire populations howling in terror before the Dark Angels even arrived. The first worlds to fill their talons were minor defenceless colonies. Settlements that had once boasted loyalty to the Imperium woke to skies filled with drop pods. The Night Lords fell upon them with ritual cruelty, slaying governors, broadcasting executions, and filling orbit with burning wreckage. By the time the Lion's fleet reached these systems, they found only smouldering ruins and messages scored in blood across the walls. Ave Dominus Nox. But the Dark Angels did not falter. The Lion countered terror with relentless pursuit. His fleets advanced with precision, each movement designed to box the Night Lords into a corner. He hunted them as one would hunt a beast, confident that patience and steel would bring the kill. Curze responded with a gambit that revealed his twisted brilliance. He sent a signal to the Lion, requesting parley on Togolsa, a barren world the Night Lords used as a hidden base. Some said Curze sought reconciliation, others whispered it was a trap from the beginning. The Lion, proud and unyielding, accepted. He landed with a retinue of warriors and confronted his brother upon the Ash Plains. The meeting degenerated almost instantly. The Night Haunter spoke of hypocrisy, of an Imperium built on lies, of the Emperor's empire already rotting. The Lion, insulted, drew his blade. The duel was brutal, savage, a clash not only of strength but of philosophy. Curze fought like a predator, fast and merciless, seeking to drag his brother into the same mire of fear he embodied. At one point, he nearly strangled the Lion with his own gauntleted hands, forcing the Dark Angel to his knee. Only the intervention of the Lion's warriors saved him, driving blades into Curze's flesh and forcing a withdrawal. Both Primarchs left wounded, the ground between them scarred with blood and hate. The war escalated. Battles spread across the void, each one more desperate than the last. At the Cerberus Strait, the Dark Angels finally cornered the Night Lord's fleet. The Lion's trap was flawless. Warships emerged from hidden routes, cutting off Curze's avenues of escape. Broadsides thundered across the void as two legions tore into one another. For all their savagery, the Night Lords could not match the sheer discipline and firepower of the First Legion. Ship after ship was crippled, whole companies of Astartes burned alive in their halls. Curze fought personally aboard the Nightfall, his flagship, directing boarding assaults even as his body bled from wounds unhealed since Degwalsa. When the Lion boarded himself, the two brothers clashed once more in a duel that shattered bulkheads. This time, the Dark Angel triumphed. He struck Curze down, breaking his body and leaving him a shattered wreck. The Night Haunter was dragged away by his sons, unconscious, his once fearsome frame a ruin of broken bone and flesh. Leadership fell to First Captain Sevatar, known as the Prince of Crows. Brilliant and ruthless, Sevatar refused to let the Legion collapse. He ordered the fleet to scatter into 6 groups, a desperate measure to preserve what remained. To buy them time, he led a Terminator strike force in a suicidal boarding of the Dark Angel's flagship, Invincible Reason. The fighting within the Void ship's corridors was apocalyptic. Bolters roaring at point-blank range, power fists crushing Terramite, chain blades shrieking as they tore through bone. Sevatar cut down dozens, his Atramentar slaughtering their way towards the heart of the ship. But even the Prince of Crows could not hold back the tide. He was overwhelmed, captured, his warriors slain around him. The Night Lord's last great defiance ended in chains and silence. Yet the VIII Legion did not die. As their fragments fled, a strange phenomenon unfolded aboard the Invincible Reason. Konrad Curze awoke. Broken, fevered, yet alive, he slipped from the infirmary like smoke. The Lion ship became his hunting ground. For months he stalked its shadow corridors, murdering sentries, sabotaging systems, leaving his brother to rage helplessly at a foe who melted back into the dark after every strike. To the crew, the vessel became a haunted house, each step echoing with the fear that the Night Haunter was watching from the void. Eventually, Curze found his chance, seizing a drop pod and hurling himself into the darkness, escaping once again into the wilderness of the galaxy. The Thramas Crusade ended not with a decisive triumph, but with exhaustion and ruin. The Dark Angels had broken the Night Lords as a coherent legion, shattering their fleets and scattering their companies. Yet they had paid a terrible price in blood and time, and their pursuit of Curze delayed them from the Siege of Terror. For the Night Lords, it was a Pyrrhic survival. They were fractured, their Primarch crippled and obsessed with his own death visions, their first captain a prisoner. But they endured. In the ruins of the Thramas Crusade, the Night Lord's future was forged. No longer a unified legion, they became a scattered murder of warbands, bound not by loyalty but by fear and legacy. Their war had proven a simple truth. They could not win through discipline or cohesion. They could only endure as predators, hunting in the shadows, killing not for victory, but for the certainty that terror itself could never be destroyed. The Thramas Crusade was more than a campaign. It was the twilight of the Night Lords as a legion, and the dawn of their long war as scattered fiends of the dark. From this moment onward, the galaxy would never face them as one army again, but as countless shadows, each carrying the creed of their father. Fear is eternal, fear is victory. The fires of the Thramas Crusade left Konrad Curze broken, his body fractured, his legion shattered into fleeing remnants. Yet the Night Haunter was not finished. He drifted through the eastern fringe, a predator without a pack, guided not by strategy, but by the gnawing prophecies that had stalked him since his youth. Those visions drew him inexorably toward the 500 worlds of Ultramar, where another drama of the heresy was unfolding. There, Rabuti Guilliman sought to forge a sanctuary amid the galaxy's ruin, Imperium Secundus, a second empire to outlast the first. Into this fragile hope fell the shadow of the Night Lord's Primarch, a spectre determined to unmake it with his own hands. Curze's arrival upon Macragge was as silent as it was devastating. His escape from the Dark Angel's flagship left him half dead, but where others might have sought refuge, he sought prey. He slipped into hive cities like a phantom, haunting their arteries with patient malice. Administrators were found garroted in their offices, magistrates butchered on courthouse steps, whole families slaughtered in their beds. Each killing was ritualistic, calculated not to end lives alone, but to seed terror in every corner of Ultramar's capital. The people of Macragge had long believed themselves safe, guarded by the Ultramarines' discipline and Guilliman's vision. But fear is the most efficient weapon Curze ever wielded, and soon the proud citizenry of Ultramar whispered curfews and kept to torchlight. In taverns and manufactoria, tales spread of a creature stalking the Allies, its pale face glimpsed only in reflections, its claws leaving trails of rent metal in the walls. It was said he could move through locked doors as if there was smoke, that he killed in complete silence and left only a mocking phrase scrawled in blood: "The Night Haunter watches." Guilliman could not ignore such a phantom. He declared martial law, deploying his finest warriors to root out the assassin. Patrols marched in perfect order through the streets, yet none could pin down their quarry. The killings continued. The more the Ultramarines tightened their grip, the more Curze slipped through their fingers, leaving bodies in places that mocked their vigilance. In barracks, atop Vox towers, even within the shadow of Guilliman's own fortress. The angelic Sanguinius, who had come to Ultramar seeking alliance after Istvan, sensed the growing despair. His psychic gifts burned with foreboding, and he warned Guilliman that the figure in the shadows was no ordinary murderer but a brother. It was then they sprang their trap. Using astropathic bait and a staged procession of nobles, they drew Curze into a plaza laced with hidden squads. As he descended upon the lure, Sanguinius himself met him in the open. The duel between them was terrible. Curze fought with the desperation of a cornered beast, his talons striking with lightning speed, his laughter echoing across the plaza. Sanguinius answered with poise and wrath, his wings beating storms into the night air, his sword gleaming like a shard of the Emperor's own light. Their blows carved craters into ferrocrete, sparks showering as talons clashed against blade. Yet Curze was already weakened from his wounds at Thramas and from the endless attrition of his war. Slowly, inevitably, the Great Angel pressed him back. At last, with a strike that shattered ribs and drove him into the rubble, Sanguinius brought his brother down. Chains heavier than before were forged, shackling the Night Haunter in the bowels of Macragge's fortress of Hera. There he languished in a black cell, watched night and day by ultramarine wardens who dared not even speak his name aloud. But Curze was not silent. He filled the darkness with his voice, a ceaseless torrent of prophecy, accusation, and laughter. Guards reported that he spoke of each of their deaths in detail, describing wounds not yet taken. Some broke beneath the pressure, others went mad, a few ended their lives rather than hear his whispers. Before the assembled triumvirate of Imperium Secundus, Guilliman, Sanguinius, and Lionel Johnson, Curze was paraded in chains. They debated his fate. Some demanded execution for his crimes, others argued that killing a Primarch would stain even this new Imperium beyond repair. The Lion, grim as ever, confronted Curze in person. He demanded to know why his brother revelled in slaughter, why he spurned their father's vision. Curze answered was delivered with a smirk and a whisper that carried through the chamber. Why not? Those two words chilled the hall. To Curze, morality was an illusion, justice a mask for vengeance, and order nothing more than fear dressed in ceremony. He mocked Guilliman's noble Imperium Secundus, declaring it doomed before it drew its first breath. You build your empire on light, he sneered, but every candle casts a shadow, and I am that shadow. As long as I live, hope will rot. In time, judgment was passed. Curze was to die by Sanguinius' hand. The Great Angel stood above him in his cell, sword poised to end the Night Haunter's reign of terror once and for all. Yet fate is seldom so simple. Before the killing stroke could fall, Lionel Johnson intervened. He stayed Sanguinius' hand, arguing that to execute their brother in cold blood would taint them as surely as Curze was tainted. Sanguinius hesitated, torn between duty and the horror of fratricide. The decision was ripped from them by events far greater. Word reached Macragge that the Emperor still lived, and terror still stood, and that the siege was at hand. Imperium Secundus, born of despair, was revealed as a false foundation. Guilliman and his brothers turned their eyes back to the true war, vowing to march through the ruin storm to rejoin the Imperium's heart. In the chaos of these revelations, Curze slipped his bonds. Some accounts whispered that the Lion himself loosened his chains, perhaps out of pity, perhaps to test destiny. Others insist that Curze's will was so strong, his body so steeped in prophecy, that no prison could truly hold him. What is certain is that when the fleets of Imperium Secundus departed, the Night Haunter was no longer their captive. He vanished into the warp storms, a lone phantom amid the galaxy's greatest convulsion. For Guilliman, it was a bitter reminder that hope is never secure. For Sanguinius, it was a foretelling of the tragic destiny awaiting him on Terra's walls. And for Curze, it was vindication. Even in chains he could not be contained. The shadow he cast over Imperium Secundus was more than the murders he committed or fear he sowed. It was the revelation that even in the most disciplined, hopeful corner of the Imperium, terror could not be banished. By his presence alone, Curze had proven his philosophy once more. Light can never banish the night, it can only delay it. Thus the Night Haunter left Macragge not as a prisoner, but as a prophecy fulfilled. He had shown his brothers the futility of their ideals, shattered their illusions of safety, and walked free into the abyss. Imperium Secundus crumbled, but his legacy endured. From that day forward, wherever hope dared to kindle, there was always the whisper of a figure in the dark, laughing softly, reminding mankind that no empire, no matter how noble, could ever escape its shadow. Konrad Curze had lived his entire life beneath the weight of prophecy. Since the moment he opened his eyes on Nostramo, visions of murder and ruin had stalked him like carrion crows. He had seen the Imperium's fall, the betrayal of his brothers, the death of his homeworld, and his own doom. For decades, he had laughed at fate and embraced it in equal measure, but by the time the Siege of Terror ended in blood and ashes, and Horus fell beneath the Emperor's hand, Curze's course was already set. He would not become a ruler in exile like Perturabo. He would not ascend to demonhood like Fulgrim or Angron. He would not command a legion still whole as Guilliman did. Konrad Curze would end as he lived, alone, in darkness, vindicated only by death. After the collapse of the traitor legions in the Scouring, Curze did not rally his sons to fight on. He did not carve out a kingdom or claim dominion within the Eye of Terror. Instead, he withdrew. His body was broken from years of war, his mind eaten hollow by prophecy. He no longer sought power, only confirmation. He fled into the eastern fringe, drifting through warp lanes in a battered warship, hounded but never cornered. Some reports claimed he returned to Tgulsa, the world where he had once lured the Lion to battle, its airless waste now his chosen tomb. Others whispered he wandered countless shadowed systems, haunting them like a phantom until the end. Wherever he lingered, his presence poisoned worlds. Imperial colonists whispered of murders in the night, of governors found eviscerated in their chambers, of warning messages etched into walls by talons that glowed like fire. He no longer commanded fleets or armies, he stalked alone, leaving ruin behind. Each killing was not a campaign but a sermon, each corpse a punctuation mark in the story he had always tried to tell, that justice was a lie, and fear was the only truth. The Imperium could not allow him to endure. Though the heresy had ended, the stain of Curze's name lingered in every record of atrocity, every survivor's broken testimony. Guilliman demanded his death. The High Lords agreed. To leave the Night Haunter alive was to leave a contradiction of their claim that the Emperor's light had triumphed, and so the Assassinorium was dispatched. From the shadowed temples of the Calidus Clade came Meshen, trained in deception, shapeshifting, and the art of silent death. Where armies had failed to catch him, the Imperium gambled on a single blade. Curze knew she was coming. He said as much to the terrified mortal servants who attended his vessel. He dreamt of her arrival, saw her approach in the haze of his visions, felt her presence drawing nearer with every passing day. But he did nothing to stop it. He issued no orders for his Night Lords to guard him. He set no traps, laid no ambushes. He waited. When Meshen finally stepped into his chamber, she found no warlord clad in midnight ceramite. She found a gaunt, pale figure seated in the gloom, eyes sunk deep into a face that looked more like a corpse than living. Hollow projectors displayed scenes of Nostramo's underhives, of streets slick with blood, gallows lined with bodies. The chamber smelled of iron and rain, though no storm touched that place. Curze looked up at her with a weary smile, as though greeting an old friend. "Your presence does not surprise me," he said softly. "I have known of you since your craft entered the eastern fringes. Why did I not have you killed? Because your mission, and the act you are about to commit, proves the truth of all I have ever said and done. I merely punished those who had wronged, just as your false emperor now seeks to punish me. Death is nothing compared to vindication." The words, captured by hidden recorders, would echo for millennia. Meshen hesitated only a moment, then she struck. Her neural blade slid cleanly into Curze's chest. The Primarch shuddered, exhaled, and slumped without resistance. There was no battle, no last roar of defiance, only silence, as though the shadows themselves had claimed him. The Night Haunter had died as he lived, in darkness, unrepentant, certain that his end proved him right. He had not fled, he had not fought, he had awaited judgment and embraced it as the final fulfillment of his prophecy. His last act to leave the Imperium with his recorded words, forcing them to confront the hypocrisy he saw at their core. The aftermath was as bloody as the act itself. When word of Curze's death reached his scattered sons, their reactions were feral. Some Night Lords hunted the Calidus assassin, seeking to avenge their father. Some say they cornered Meshen and tore her apart, her blood spilled as payment for their Primarch. Others claim she escaped into the shadows, her mission complete, leaving the warbands to fight among themselves. The truth, as ever with the Night Lords, is hidden in fear and rumour. What is certain is that the Legion did not recover. With Curze gone, there was no unifying figure, no voice, mad or otherwise, to bind them. They splintered fully, scattering into warbands led by captains, champions, and murderers who each carried a shard of Curze's philosophy. Some turned to piracy, preying on trade routes like carrion. Others became mercenaries in the service of greater warlords. A few carried on his vision most purely, raiding worlds not for plunder, but solely to terrify. Never again would they muster as one legion. Their father's death was the end of the VIII Legion as a unified force. Yet his shadow lingered. In Imperial histories, his assassination became both a triumph and a scandal. Triumph, for one of the most Empress-hated traitor sons had been slain. Scandal, for his own words made it clear he had allowed it. Had the Imperium executed justice, or had they merely played into his prophecy, proving that their empire relied on the same sanctioned murder he had always wielded? Konrad Curze's death was not a conclusion but a mirror. It reflected the Imperium's brutality back upon itself. For some scholars, his end was the moment the Imperium of Man crossed a threshold, embracing the same darkness it had condemned in him. For his sons, it was proof they were truly orphans, unbound from all restraint. And for Curze himself, it was vindication. The final cruel laugh of a man who had always claimed he would die by justice's hand. The galaxy rolled on, indifferent, but in the shadows of 10,000 years, the echo of that laugh never died. Wherever men whisper of murder in the dark, Wherever fear is used as a weapon, the spirit of Konrad Curze lingers. His body lies cold, his legion broken, but his philosophy endures. And in the final balance, perhaps that is what he always wanted. Not survival, not victory, but the certainty that even in death, the Night Haunter's truth could never be silenced. During the Great Scouring, the Imperium launched a merciless counterattack against the traitor forces. Loyalist legions and the newborn chapters of the Second Founding drove into the warp-torn expanses where traitors had fled. Some legions retreated into the Eye of Terror, embracing damnation and the patronage of the Dark Gods. Others attempted to hold shattered empires together. The Night Lords chose neither path. They did not retreat into the Eye en masse. They did not crown a new warlord. They scattered. The scattering was not orderly. Fragments of fleets limped through the void, some led by bitter Terran veterans who still clung to the vestige of discipline, others commanded by Nostramo-born killers with no goal beyond plunder. Some ships vanished into the warp and were never seen again, their screams echoing only in astropathic nightmares. Others emerged years later, bearing the marks of cannibalistic feuds fought between brothers over dwindling supplies. The Night Lord's fracturing was total, a legion shattered not by outside conquest but by the nature Curze had instilled in them. Predators could not truly unite without turning on each other. In the centuries that followed, these warbands became phantoms of the galaxy. They emerged without warning, striking like lightning in exposed worlds before vanishing into the dark once more. On hive worlds, enforcer precincts told horror stories of Astartes descending in the night, killing entire city blocks and leaving flayed corpses hung like banners. On frontier colonies, settlers reported seeing armoured figures prowling the edges of their settlements, never attacking at first, merely watching, until the day came when the skies split open and killing began. Fear was still their greatest weapon, and without a Primarch to direct them, they wielded it in abandon. Unlike the World Eaters, they did not need berserk rage to devastate a city. Unlike the Emperor's children, they did not require excess to revel in atrocity. Unlike the Word-bearers, they had no sermons or demonic patronage. The Night Lords needed only the human imagination. Rumours of their approach alone was often enough to collapse order. Governors executed suspected traitors before the Night Lords ever arrived. Citizens rioted in terror of an attack that might never come. By existing, by being remembered, the Sons of Nostramo destabilised whole sectors. The Imperium learned to dread them not as a legion, but as a contagion. A single warband could do what an entire army failed to achieve, turn a stable world into chaos. Administratum reports from the early 32nd millennium speak of planets surrendering to Imperial oversight twice over. First to avoid rebellion, second to avoid the Night Lords. For Imperial commanders, the words Ave Dominus Nox scrawled in blood across a wall were far more dangerous than an orbital bombardment. It was proof that the predators had already been there, and they could return at will. Among the scattered warbands, some became infamous in their own right. The Bleeding Eye, commanded by a captain named Krakesh, annihilated the world of Grendel's Rest by methodically killing every inhabitant over a campaign of weeks, broadcasting each execution until the planet was silent. The Claws of Sorrow, a small but brutal band, infiltrated void convoys and turned merchant ships into carnal houses, then sent them drifting back into Imperial space as floating tombs. These warbands were not armies, at most a few hundred warriors each, but their impact was seismic. Entire subsectors tied up resources hunting them, always too late, always finding only the remnants of their slaughter. In this time, the question of faith became a dividing line. Many traitor legions were seduced fully by the Dark Gods, offering themselves as instruments of chaos in return for power. The Night Lords remained aloof, their hatred of hypocrisy extended even to demonic pacts. Though some captains dabbled, trading souls for weapons, calling upon warp-born sorcery, most rejected worship outright. They saw themselves as masters of terror, not slaves to gods. To them, those who bowed before the ruinous powers were little different than the Imperials who bowed before the Emperor. It was just another lie, another leash. This disdain made them enemies even among traitors. When Abaddon began rallying the remnants of the heresy into his Black Crusades, the Night Lords were seldom counted on. They might appear in a war zone striking opportunistically, but they refused to kneel to the Warmaster of Chaos. At times, they even turned on their supposed allies, slaughtering fellow renegades to seize plunder. Treachery was their constancy. For the Night Lords, alliance was merely opportunities for fresh betrayal. The Imperium, for its part, never managed to destroy them outright. The Night Lords were too dispersed, too unpredictable. Strike forces dispatched to hunt them often found themselves ambushed, their commanders publicly executed as warnings to others. When a Fortress World garrison finally cornered one warband in 834.M34, the Night Lords detonated the planetary's primary reactors rather than allow capture, killing themselves and millions of civilians in a single act of nihilistic spite. To the Imperium, it was a victory. To the Night Lords, it was proof of Curze's philosophy. Death is nothing compared to vindication. Through these centuries, one truth became clear. Without Curze, the Night Lords could not exist as a legion. They had no shared vision beyond terror, no banner to rally beneath. But as warbands, as fractured predators, they thrived. They became exactly what Nostramo had bred them to be, gangs of killers in the night, each vying to outdo the other in cruelty. The galaxy would never again face them as a unified force. Instead, it would live forever in fear of their fragments. By the close of the 34th millennium, Imperial cartographers had adopted the grim euphemism, regions of shadow. These were sectors so plagued by sporadic Night Lord activity that they were deemed permanently unstable. Entire subsectors were written off, left to rot under the occasional predation of warbands that came and went like wolves among sheep. To the Imperium, the cost of holding such worlds exceeded their value. To the Night Lords, these regions became their hunting grounds, kept perpetually on the edge of collapse by terror alone. Thus the VIII Legion endured, not as a great engine of conquest, not as a unified brotherhood, but as a nightmare too fragmented to kill. Scattered in the shadows, they became eternal, each warband a reminder that even broken monsters still have claws, and that fear needed no empire to thrive. Wherever the Astronomicon's light faltered, wherever watchfires guttered and courage waned, the Night Lords would descend, whispering the creed of their dead father into the terrified dark. The absence of unity did not make them weak. Fragmentation was their strength. Each warband struck differently. Some operated as pirates, others as assassins, others still as butchers who left only silence in their wake. None coordinated with another, but that mattered little. A governor whose world had been flayed by one Night Lord band did not distinguish it from another. To the Imperium, they were one nightmare, one exhaustible plague of terror. In this era, their campaigns became infamous not for their scale of battles, but their artistry of fear. In 999.M37, amid the maelstrom of Abaddon's 8th Black Crusade, a Night Lord's warband known as the Weeping Talons descended upon the Amdramok system. While the War Master's armies fought the Imperium at the Cadian Gate, these Sons of Curze slipped deep behind Imperial lines. They seized the Fortress Monarch of the Marines' errant successor chapter in a lightning strike that stunned even hardened commanders. Yet once the fortress was theirs, they did not hold it. Instead, they turned on their allies, fellow heretics who had aided their assault, slaughtering them to claim the spoils for themselves. In the aftermath, they left the fortress in ruins, booby-trapped with corpses that exploded when loyalist reinforcements finally arrived. Such treachery was their signature. Allies existed only to be used, and then discarded in fresh blood. Elsewhere, worlds suffered differently. On Tiaran in the 38th millennium, the population awoke to find their skies torn open by virus bombs. The Night Lords had no interest in siege or tribute. They poisoned the world in a single day, its billions of citizens dissolving into slurry, their screams carried over Vox for all neighbouring systems to hear. In the ashes, the Night Lords left a single monument, a Vox beacon repeating endlessly, "Obedience is an illusion, fear is truth." Imperial forces later destroyed the beacon, but its echo remained in survivor accounts, passed down as folk curse for centuries. What distinguished the Night Lords in these millennia was not the number of their victims, but the way they shaped fear into a weapon that outlived them. Rebellions erupted in regions they had never touched, sparked by terror alone. Refugees carried their stories across warp routes, each retelling sharpening the reputation of the Eighth. In this way, even a small warband could destabilise entire subsectors. A strike of a few hundred warriors might collapse the defences of dozens of worlds simply because governors surrendered to terror before a single bolter was fired. Yet for all their independence, whispers persisted of leaders who sought to unify the fragments. One such figure rose in the 40th millennium, Krieg Akabus, a warlord of terrifying charisma who claimed the mantle of demonhood. His ascension divided the Night Lords. Some flocked to his banner, drawn by his promise of restoring the Legion's glory. Others spat on the idea of demonhood, seeing it as servitude to the very gods they despised. Akabus carved his reign in blood, leading vast fleets to terrorise the Eastern Fringe, but his Legion reborn never truly coalesced. Old rivalries and mistrust kept the Night Lords fractured. Even elevated to a demon prince, Akabus could not command the Curze's scattered sons as their father once had. Their disdain for chaos worship remained one of their defining traits. While the World Eaters gave themselves to Khorne, the Emperor's children drowned in Selenesh's excess, and the Thousand Sons bent the knee to Tzeentch, the Night Lords continued to cling to their own nihilistic creed. They did not deny the existence of gods, nor refuse their power entirely. They used demonic pacts and warped sorcery when it suited them, but they refused worship. To them, submission to a deity was no different from the lies of the Emperor. They lived and killed for fear alone. This contempt often put them at odds with other traitor forces. On more than one occasion, they turned their blades on allies mid-battle, slaughtering cultists and demon hosts with the same relish they reserved for Imperial soldiers. The Imperium's records in this period are full of frustrated reports. Inquisitors complained that they could never corner the Night Lords, that their lack of hierarchy made them impossible to root out. One conclave concluded bitterly, to destroy them, One must destroy fear itself. Until then, they will remain eternal. Whole sectors were declared shadow zones, their instability written off as the permanent cost of Night Lord predation. Administratum scribes noted the pattern. Whenever the Imperium weakened, during the apostasy, during the Intersign Wars, during Xenos incursions, the Night Lords would emerge, carving misery from opportunity. And always they spoke with the voice of Curze. His sayings, his prophecy, his nihilism, these were their scripture. Warbands painted his words on walls in blood, broadcast them across hijacked box channels, and carved them into the flesh of victims. Even 10,000 years after his death, his final declaration remained their creed: death is nothing compared to vindication. By the 40th millennium, their legend had solidified. They were no longer remembered as warriors of the Great Crusade, nor even as traitors of the heresy. They were remembered as predators, shadows that fell without warning, angels of terror who proved again and again that civilization was only skin deep. Imperial citizens learned to measure their courage not by the strength of their armies, but by whether they could endure the fear of the Eighth's arrival, and most could not. Thus the Night Lords survived not by unity, not by empire, but by dread itself. Every scream, every massacre, every whispered rumour fed them, keeping them alive long after their Primarch's bones had turned to dust. They had become the embodiment of the galaxy's most primal truth. In the darkness, fear rules. By the time the 41st millennium unfurled in blood and ruin, the Imperium had learned to dread the Long War, that endless grinding struggle waged by the traitor legions across 10,000 years. For most, it meant the mass Black Crusades of Abaddon, the warp storms of demon legions, or the berserk rage of the World Eaters. But for the Night Lords, the Long War was not fought as campaigns of conquest. It was carried out as murder without end, a war of whispers and screams, of lightning strikes and vanishing shadows. Unlike their traitor kin, the Night Lords never rallied to Abaddon's call in great strength. They despised him as they despised all who claimed crowns, mocking the very idea of a war master of chaos. To their fractured warbands, he was nothing but another would-be tyrant, a pretender to the role of their long-dead father. When they fought in his crusades, it was never out of loyalty, but for plunder, opportunity, or the sheer delight of inflicting terror upon fresh prey. They would arrive at a battlefield as allies and leave as carrion feeders, scavenging what they could before turning on their supposed comrades. Even Abaddon's patience for them was limited, but he could never afford to cast them aside completely. For when the Night Lords descended, they left scars on the soul of the Imperium that no legion could rival. The 41st millennium birthed infamous warlords whose deeds became whispered legends. One such figure was Talas Valkorion, known to some as the Soul Hunter. Once a sergeant, he rose to prominence after a vision-driven campaign that saw his warband carve through Imperial sectors with surgical cruelty. Talas was not like many of his kin. Though he killed without hesitation, his soul was haunted, burdened with the same prophetic curse that plagued Curze. He foresaw death long before they happened, dreams dripping with the blood of comrades he had yet to lose. To his followers, this marked him as touched by their father's spirit, perhaps even chosen by fate to carry the Night Haunter's legacy. Talos' band, later remembered as the Exalted, prowled the eastern fringe during the dying centuries of the 41st millennium. They struck Imperial convoys and planetary garrisons, but their purpose was not conquest. Each strike was meant to spread panic, to prove that the Imperium's grip was nothing but illusion. A single raid by the Soul Hunter's warband could unmake a governor's confidence for decades, for it was not the losses that mattered, but the reminder that fear was eternal. In Soul Hunter, Aaron Dembski-Bowden would later write of their methods. They were not soldiers, they were hunters. Every death was bait, every atrocity a snare, every terror a harvest. But Talas' warband was not the only one to carve infamy. The Bleeding Eyes resurfaced in M41, launching terror campaigns that paralysed trade across the Segmentum Tempest. The Prophets of Pain, another notorious group, took to capturing Imperial citizens by the thousands, subjecting them to prolonged torture not for information, but to record their screams and broadcast them across astropathic channels. For those who received the psychic echoes, it was as if the Night Lords had reached into their very minds, whispering the certainty of death. This era also revealed the Legion's peculiar relationship with chaos. While some individuals bore the marks of mutation or wielded demonic weapons, the Night Lords as a whole still resisted the worship of gods. They spat on those who called themselves champions of Khorne or Tzeentch, deriding them as slaves wearing different chains. To them, their power lay not in the favour of the warp, but in the human heart's instinctive terror of death. Their rejection of Chaos's embrace made them pariahs even among traitors. While the word bearers prayed, the Night Lords laughed. While the Iron Warriors built fortresses, the Night Lords desecrated them. Their philosophy remained unchanged since Curze's fall. Empires are lies, faith is hypocrisy, and only fear endures. Still, the Long War shaped them. They could not escape the galaxy's chaos entirely. Some warbands bartered with demons for survival. Others fell under the sway of charismatic sorcerers who promised visions of Curze's return. But no matter how far they strayed, their loyalty was never to gods or overlords, it was always to terror itself. They remained scavengers in the dark, tearing at the flanks of the Imperium not to topple it, but to prove that it would never truly be secure. The Imperium's response was as fragmented as the threat itself. Few chapters of loyalist Space Marines ever prioritised the Night Lords above greater foes. Why waste fleets on shadows, commanders argued, when Hive fleets consumed whole worlds and demon legions besieged star systems? Yet the Inquisition knew better. To them, the Night Lords were not measured by scale, but by impact. A single strike could unravel faith in the Emperor more efficiently than 100 Orc wars. A massacre in one city could spark rebellions across a dozen systems. They are not a legion, one inquisitorial record grimly notes, but a poison, and a poison need not be large to kill. Talis Valkron's fate embodied this truth. His visions grew ever darker, showing him the death of his brothers and the inevitability of his own doom. Yet he did not flee, he accepted the future as Curze once had. During one final campaign, he struck at Imperial forces knowing full well he would not return. His warband carried him to the heart of battle, where prophecy fulfilled itself in blood. To the Imperium, it was the death of a warlord. To the Night Lords, it was vindication, another echo of their father's cursed foresight, another reminder that destiny and terror walked hand in hand. By the close of the 41st millennium, the galaxy trembled with new cataclysms. The birth of the Great Rift, the resurrection of Rabuti Guilliman, and the spread of the Adeptus Crusade. Yet through it all, the Night Lords endured. They had no empire to defend, no demon worlds to maintain, no crusade to wage. They thrived in the cracks, emerging where the Imperium's watch was weakest, feeding on the terror left in the wake of the larger wars. In truth, the Long War was never their struggle, it was their hunting ground. Thus the Night Lords carried their father's creed into the 41st millennium, unchanged and unbroken. They did not need to win, they did not need to conquer, they needed only to remind mankind of the truth Konrad Curze had etched into his own flesh. Justice is a lie, order is fragile, and fear will always rule the night. And so the war continues, 10,000 years after their Primarch's death. Not a war of victory, nor even for survival, but for the vindication of a single philosophy whispered in every shadow where men still fear the dark. 10,000 years after Konrad Curze's death, the Night Lords remain unquiet. Their Primarch's body may lie in dust, his voice silenced by an assassin's blade, but his presence endures, in the memory of his sons, in the legacy of terror he carved into the galaxy, and in the nightmares of all who speak their name. To encounter the VIII Legion in the Age of the Dark Imperium is to face not just warriors in Midnight Plate, but the echo of a man who never truly left the shadows. Unlike many of their traitor kin, the Night Lords did not vanish into demonhood or bind themselves to dark pantheons. They remain mortal in the most brutal sense of the word. Their armour is scarred ceramite, not gilded with warp-born blessings. Their fleets are patchwork ruins, scavenged from victories and theft. Their ranks dwindle with every generation, replaced not by fresh recruits, but by desperate aspirants seized from conquered worlds, tortured into service. They are, in many ways, a dying breed. And yet, paradoxically, their terror is sharper than ever, because every atrocity feels like the work of men who knew they were already condemned. In the era of the Great Rift, when the galaxy is split in two and even the Emperor's light flickers, the Night Lords thrive as carrion feeders. They haunt the Imperium Nihilus, where beaconless void stretches for years and despair is already a native tongue. Here, their warbands are not merely raiders but myths given flesh. Ships vanish without trace, their hulls later found drifting, crew flayed and nailed to the bulkheads in silent screams. Colonies erupt into riots after whispered rumours of midnight-clad warriors. Entire sectors collapse into anarchy without the Night Lords ever needing to fire a shot. Their methods remain unchanged since Nostramo. They strike where fear will spread the farthest. They do not always kill the most, they kill the most visibly. A governor's public execution destabilises a world more than the quiet death of 1,000 workers. A single tortured survivor, released to spread his tale, can break an army's morale before the first engagement. Terror is still their strategy, but in the fractured Imperium, terror finds even more fertile ground. Some warbands have grown notorious in this age. The Carrion Hounds, led by the infamous warlord Vandrid Arathi, strike from the warp-ravaged eastern fringe, their ships daubed with the blood of their captives. They delight in leaving vox broadcasts of their hunts, forcing entire worlds to listen as their rulers beg and die. The Shrouded Claws operate differently, striking surgically at astropathic choirs and communication relays, ensuring that panic spreads unchecked. Others, like the Ebon Fangs, fight almost entirely in void space, boarding convoys and slaughtering crews before melting away into the Immaterium. Each warband is unique, but all share the same inheritance, cruelty refined into an art. And always, behind their deeds is the shadow of Curze, His words remain their scripture, painted in blood across fortress walls, whispered in vox intercepts, carved into the bodies of their victims. His philosophy, that justice is hypocrisy, that awe is built on lies, and that fear is eternal, guides them more firmly than any god or warlord ever could. Some claim to hear his voice in their dreams, mocking, laughing, urging them on. Whether these are true echoes of the warp or the lingering madness of the Nostramo bloodlines, none can say. But to the Night Lords, it is proof that their father still walks beside them in the dark. The Imperium, already fractured by the Great Rift, is more vulnerable to them than ever. Guilliman may have returned, wielding the Primarch and the Adeptus Crusade, but even his reborn empire cannot watch every shadow. The Night Lords know this better than anyone. They do not need to break the Imperium's armies, they need only remind mankind that safety is an illusion. And in the haunted dark of Imperium Nihilus, where the Astronomicon cannot guide, their message finds endless resonance. Yet for all their endurance, they remain tragic. The Night Lords will never rebuild themselves into a Great Legion. They will never raise a banner that unites their fragments. They are too steeped in treachery, too divided by mistrust, too committed to the nihilism their father left them. Each warband fights not to achieve a destiny, but to prove that destiny is meaningless. Their survival is paradox. They endure because they have no goal, and thus they can never fail. But perhaps that is what makes them eternal. Other legions seek crowns, demonhood, or vengeance. The Night Lords seek only to be feared, and fear is inexhaustible. It needs no empire, no victory, no gods. It feeds on whispers, shadows, and silence. So long as mankind trembles in the dark, the sons of Curze will never truly die. In the end, Konrad Curze was right. His visions were not lies, nor delusions. He foresaw his own death, and it came to pass. He foresaw the Imperium's decay, and it festers still. He foresaw his legion's dissolution, and it is reality. And what he also foresaw, though perhaps he never admitted it, was that his echo would live on, not in triumph, but in inevitability. The Night Lords are his shadow, stretched across 10,000 years, and shadows do not die while there is still light to cast them. Thus, in the dark age of the 42nd millennium, the Night Lords endure. They cannot conquer, they cannot win, they cannot redeem. But they can terrify, and in terror, they are immortal. You have walked through the shadow of Nostramo, witnessed the legacy of Curze, and heard the creed of his sons. The Night Lords endure not through victory, nor through empire, but through fear itself, and fear is eternal. This was Dominissimo Voxlore. Strike the seal of subscription or be left in the dark when the next transmission arrives.